All right, fantastic. Well, welcome everyone. Can everyone hear me all right? Our audio doing all good? We can all see the screen, we can see the slides, fantastic. I see the thumbs up from Daniella. Well, welcome back. We are so thrilled to have you. We're really excited to dive into GREMax verbal reasoning today. For those of us who haven't been here before, we're just gonna briefly reintroduce ourselves. I'm Jonathan Herzog. So thrilled to be leading our GRE content here at GREMax. Just briefly by way of background, I actually love the GRE, but my background was I have a JD from Harvard Law, an MBA from NYU Stern, to my undergrad at Harvard as well, and have been working and teaching and doing classrooms and tutoring in the GRE for many years. And I'm really excited to dive into some really fun verbal reasoning and logical reasoning, because one of the amazing approaches of GREMax to not just our hiring, but our pedagogy is we only hire folks who were not naturals. And we had to reverse engineer and boil down the test to first principles and the building blocks that we had to struggle through ourselves without the best resources. So we're so excited to have you and thrilled to be joined by my phenomenal colleague, Daniella.
I'll just unmute myself there. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniella. Like Jonathan, I'm really excited to be here working with you all. A little bit about me. I did my undergrad in business and engineering at Berkeley. Then I did my master's in public policy at Cambridge in England. I really love the GRE as it has unlocked opportunities for me after trying all the different LSAT courses. I realized that the LSAT wasn't just a great fit, and I really love the GRE. And I've recently been accepted to multiple PhDs in political science. So if that's something that you're interested in or want to talk about, I'm here.
Yes, fantastic. And as we go, feel free to introduce yourselves, to ask questions in the chat about anything related to the content or about GREMax. Generally, I see we actually already had a question come in. Yes, most definitely. GREMax, GREMax generally are digital first. So on the iPad, on mobile, and on desktop. And I think GREMax itself is particularly app native, but we're really thrilled to be leading in that way. So here we go. As a reminder, what is the GRE test? Analytical writing, verbal reasoning, and quantitative reasoning. So today we are diving into verbal reasoning. If you wanted a broader overview, just go to YouTube, go to the GREMax channel. You can go back to our first video from a number of weeks ago and from last week for the quant section. Let's clear that. I see another question pop into the comments. Try to access on the laptop and cannot. Yes, so GREMax is, I believe, currently only in the app form, and the app itself, I think, is being developed for an online web interface. All right, verbal reasoning is vocabulary, formal logic, and reading comprehension. Broad overview of what verbal reasoning covers: vocabulary, formal logic, and reading comprehension. Critically, unfortunately also, nobody else teaches formal logic. Critically, unfortunately, nobody else teaches the foundations, the structure of logical reasoning, and that we'll dive into today. But it really helps unlock a lot of power, a lot of impact for this magical 170 score on the verbal reasoning section. So as we know, this is one of the two big 170 scores that we see on test day. That's the 99th percentile in the verbal reasoning section. You get that quant score out of 170 and that verbal score out of 170. And next week, we'll dive into analytical writing together, and that's that 0 to 6 score that you also get. As a reminder of the testing structure, there are 2 scored timed verbal sections on the GRE, plus potentially an experimental or research section. But the score that counts for that 170 is two 30-minute sections, each with 20 questions each. And we'll boil that down in just a moment, but just a reminder on what the timing and structure will look like on test day. Introduction to verbal reasoning. So we're going to start out with 6 or 7 vocabulary type 1 questions, kind of fill in the blank. We're going to start out with 5 or so combination of logical reasoning, single passage or multi-passage reading comprehension. We're going to move on to 3 to 4 vocabulary type 2, which are considered sentence equivalent structures with basically the same premise. You're looking at the language, logic, syntax, vocabulary of words in the context of sentences. And rounding it out with 5 logical reasoning and reading comprehension, again, either a single passage or multiple passages. This is what the 20 questions of those 2 verbal sections will be comprised of. All right, so let us take a look at some overarching structure of what a question can look like. And this is for a single or a unit passage. So without even reading the text here, let's just kind of get a frame of reference for what the visual mental map looks like of a logical reasoning or reading comprehension style question on the GRE verbal reasoning section. So we have up top this short passage. And we'll dive into a moment how we break down short passages into either a set of facts or an argument with premises and conclusion. But this is the first part that we see, this kind of block of text, a short passage, either a set of facts or an argument with premises and a conclusion, an argument being advanced. We see part here in purple, the question stem. So in this case, the question is, the argument's conclusion follows logically if which one of the following is assumed. There are many different types of question stems, and part of what our training and skill building will be in another section is identifying and honing our skills for different types of questions. And we'll whet our appetite today with some actual GRE questions. So we have the question stem, and then we have our answer choices. So on the GRE, we can have a traditional multiple choice with usually 5 answer choices. There will be 1 correct answer and 4 incorrect, categorically flawed, incorrect answer choices. And we'll also see on the GRE a number of select multiple or select all that apply, where there could be a number of combinations of answer choices that may apply. But the question will clearly indicate up front, again, in that question stem, what type of question it is so that you know what kind of correct answer choices or incorrect answer choices to look out for. All right. Now, with that in mind, we're going to briefly dive into an overview of one of the many tools in our toolbox that we'll develop in logical reasoning, which is identifying which passages are sets of facts versus arguments. So let's take a look at the first one together. Smoking in bed has long been the main cause of home fires. Despite a significant decline in cigarette smoking in the last 2 decades, however, there has been no comparable decline in the number of people killed in home fires. So we have a collection of statements, a set of facts, but the author or this passage is not advancing a particular claim. So we can ask ourselves, so what? What's the point? What's the argument? What's the conclusion? And here it simply says, smoking in bed has long been the main cause of home fires. Despite a decline, there is no comparable decline in the number of people killed in home fires. All right, so we have our first set of facts. Number 2, Maria won this year's local sailboat race by beating Sue, the winner in each of the 4 previous years. We can conclude, we'll get to keywords in a moment, which are not determinative, but can signal sets of facts versus arguments, we can conclude from this that Maria trained hard. So once we've identified an argument that the author or their passage is making a particular point, arguing a particular claim on the basis of a particular piece of evidence or data, which we will call the premise, the fact that she won the sailboat race by beating Sue, the winner of the 4 previous years, therefore, we can conclude for this argument that Maria trained hard. That is the inference, the conclusion being made on the basis of the premise that she won that local sailboat race. All right, we'll look briefly at a couple of other passages just together. Again, before we dive into some actual questions that we can see on test day. Number 3. The United States ranks far behind countries such as Sweden and Canada when it comes to workplace safety. In all 3 countries, joint labor management committees that oversee workplace safety conditions have been very successful in reducing occupational injuries. In the United States, such committees are found only in the few companies that have voluntarily established them. However, in Sweden and several Canadian provinces, joint safety committees are required by law and exist in all medium-sized and large workplaces. So again, we ask ourselves, so what? What's the point? What's the claim? What's the conclusion? Is a collection of statements the collection of statements leading the author, the passage, to a particular claim? In this case, we see, again, a set of facts, a collection of statements about the United States, Sweden, Canada, and comparisons about labor safety. Let's take a look at number 4. Getting our pencil together. In his book published in 1892, Gray used the same metaphor that Jordan used in her book, which was published in 1885. The metaphor is so unusual that there is little chance that 2 different people independently created. Therefore, it is highly likely that Gray read Jordan's book. The author is clearly advancing a claim, an argument, something that they're maintaining on the basis of evidence, on the basis of some premises, including the fact of the chronology that the book was published in 1885, which is before 1892, and on the basis of the infrequency or the unusual nature of this metaphor. So indeed, we have an argument. And finally, number 5, it is inaccurate to say that a diet high in refined sugar cannot cause adult onset diabetes, since, we'll look at some keywords in a moment, a diet high in refined sugar can make a person overweight, and being overweight can predispose a person to adult onset diabetes. So we'll see this in a moment, but the order of conclusions and premises in indeed arguments does not necessarily have to follow premise, premise, conclusion. It can go conclusion, premise, or any other combination therein. So again, we have our conclusion and our premises in an argument. All right. So once we've identified we have an argument, how do we then go about identifying which portions of the argument are premises and which are conclusions? Let's take a look at some key signifiers, some key words that introduce premises versus some keywords, some key signifiers that introduce conclusions. For premises, since, because, given that, for, in that, as indicated by. All of these. Let's get our pen back. All of these indicate premises. Words introducing conclusions, therefore, hence, so, it can be concluded that, we may infer for this reason. All of these indicate conclusions in our arguments. Now, we alluded to this just a moment ago, but they don't have to be in a particular order. So let's take a look at number 1 here. X is a carrot, and all carrots are vegetables. Now, we looked at briefly some formal logic structure in our initial webinar together. So we know that we can map this out as if a carrot, then a vegetable. And the conclusion is, therefore, X is a vegetable. So we have our conclusion, we have our premises. It is indeed a valid argument because X is a carrot, it matches the sufficient condition, and therefore X is a vegetable, the necessary condition is met. All right, so we have premise, conclusion. But what about in number 2? One can conclude that X is a vegetable because X is a carrot and all carrots are vegetables. So again, as we saw in a sample passage before, we can indeed have the conclusion before the premise offered in support of it. And finally, number 3, the fact that X is a carrot establishes that X is a vegetable because all carrots are vegetables. So this order can be mixed up on us and can create more complexity in the questions we will see. All right. Moving along. In our, again, brief kind of theoretical overview of some of the foundational tools that will really hone and skill build together, let's take a look at what a valid argument structure versus an invalid argument structure can look like on GRE verbal reasoning. So, as we see written down here, an argument is valid if and only if the conclusion follows logically from the stated premises, assuming the premises are true. So let's look at example number 1, premise. All carrots are vegetables. Again, if we want to formally write that out, if a carrot, then a vegetable, X is a carrot, therefore X is a vegetable. Fantastic. A valid argument structure. The conclusion does indeed follow logically from the given premises. Let's clear our screen. Let's quickly take a look at examples 2 and 3. Number 2, premise. Anyone named Sue is a girl. Premise, X is named Sue. Conclusion, X is a girl. So if we want to map this out, if you're named Sue, then you're a girl. Particular person is named Sue. The conclusion they want us to make is that we have a girl. Now let's review our criteria. An argument is valid if and only if the conclusion follows logically from the premises, assuming the premises are true. Now, is it possible for someone to be named Sue and not be a girl? Yes. So on the basis of the premise not necessarily being true, we have an invalid argument, regardless of whether we presented with someone whose name is Sue. Because again, whether a conclusion logically follows depends on assuming those premises are indeed true. And finally, number 3, premise, it is cold. Conclusion, it will snow. It is cold, therefore it will snow. So what is an unstated premise or an unstated assumption of this argument? The unstated premise, the unstated assumption is that if it is cold, then it will necessarily snow. Now, can we think of an example of when it has been cold and not snowed? Most definitely. Yesterday, wherever we might be. So we find ourselves with another invalid argument. Now on the GRE, we will see many, many, many invalid arguments, and it'll be our job to identify those unstated premises, the gaps in the logic, and identify how we can rectify them. All right, We're going to take a look now at logical opposites and logical equivalents. So let us start with what must be true. The logical opposite of what must be true is that it is not necessarily true. What is equivalent to what must be true is what cannot be false. What is the logical opposite of what cannot be false is what could be false. What is the logical equivalent of what could be false is what is not necessarily true. So we see a chain here of what constitute logical opposites and what constitute logical equivalents. Now let's take a look at the bottom half of this diagram. In certain circumstances, we may find that certain things could be true. It could be true that if it is cold, then it is snowing. What is the logical opposite of what could be true? What cannot be true? What is the logical equivalent of what could be true? What is not necessarily or not always false? What is the logical opposite of what is not necessarily false? What must be false? And now in turn, what is the logical equivalent of what must be false? What cannot be true? So again, we have our logical equivalents and our logical opposites. Now, again, in our work and in our drilling together, we will go through countless drills and countless examples to be able to really hone and refine our skills in identifying and practicing these logical equivalents and logical opposites, because they will contain a lot of power and impact in being able to beeline to the correct answer choice. All right. So indeed, we have a couple of completed examples here we can take a look at. The first being, which one of the following statements can be false? So what we're doing in this sample exercise, because what we're going to essentially apply this to is how to interpret the question stem. What type of answers would be correct under a given question stem, and what type of answers would be incorrect. So given this, which one of the following statements can be false? If we go back to our diagram of logical equivalents and logical opposites, and we reframe it in terms of what is true or not true, the correct answer choice for a question asking which of the statements can be false are statements that are not necessarily true. Therefore, we know that the incorrect answer choices, right, those 4 other answer choices when we have 5 answers on a multiple choice, are answers that must be true. So if this is getting a little bit dizzying, a little bit confusing, do not worry, because again, part of our work together is drilling and practicing and really honing, identifying those logical equivalents and logical opposites through countless examples in practice. We're just doing a brief overview for the purposes of our conversation this evening. Number 2, which one of the following must be false? All right, so we have a must be false question stem. And note, these skills of logical reasoning will not only unlock impact and your score potential on the verbal reasoning, but also on the quantitative reasoning and also on the analytical writing. And we'll show you just that in walking through many of the most common logical flaws next week. But know that these skills, this framework for logical reasoning, is not only just valuable for verbal reasoning, but in fact, even for the quant section, because every part of the GRE is a reading test. every single part of the GRE is a reasoning test using the language, logic, and syntax of the English language or of mathematics. So back to number 2, which one of the following must be false? Correct answer choices cannot be true. The 4 incorrect answer choices could be true. It is possible they may be true. Number 3, each of the following could be false, except correct answer choices must be true. Incorrect answer choices, not necessarily true. Number 4, as the following statement, all of the following statements must be false, except correct answer choices could be true. Incorrect answer choices cannot be true. All right. We are getting somewhere. As always, feel free to pop in and chime in with any questions, thoughts, reflections as we go. But we're about to dive into some GRE questions very, very soon. So we're going to take a quick overview, a quick glance at some quantifiers. Now, these terms, these particular words carry significant importance, again, not just on verbal reasoning, but also especially on quantitative reasoning and also on the analytical writing section. So let's start out with none, or 0, or 0%. And what is the polar opposite, the polar extreme of none? It would be all. So 100%. Now, this is where logical opposites are distinct from polar opposites, or where the formal logical reasoning is different from our common parlance or intuition sometimes, where there are strict definitions for what certain quantifiers mean and don't mean. So let's start again with the more familiar ones, which is half, which is exactly 50%, most, which is exactly and strictly greater than 50%. Note that most does not necessarily mean 75%. It does not necessarily mean 99%, nor does it necessarily mean 51%. Strictly speaking, it means greater than 50%. Likewise, by corollary, most are not is going to be less than 50%. But critically, some is only going to mean at least 1. Some does not necessarily mean 2, 3, 5, 10, 1,000. Some literally only means at least 1. And again, a corollary, not all, or some are not, is going to only literally mean at least 1 is not. So just not all, or just not none. So there are a number of other quantifiers, and again, we'll drill and dive in through practice and seeing how they apply in numerous contexts. But just to sensitize our awareness, call our attention to how important quantifiers or words that indicate a particular quantity or number of terms will be on verbal reasoning, but also, again, on quant as well as on analytical writing. So with that, if there are no other questions in the chat, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Daniella, for our first question of the evening.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. That was a really great overview. What we're going to do right now is apply some of the things that we've learned in the past few minutes to actual real GRE questions. Jonathan, if you have any additions or anything else, or if anyone here participating has anything to add, please do jump in. Audience participation is great. So what I'm going to do first is read through the question, and we're going to note some of the different aspects of the question. So, and if I turn my head to the side here, it's because I'm looking at the iPad and I'm not distracted. So I'm here with you all. So electric washing machines, first introduced in the United States in 1925, significantly reduced the amount of time spent washing a given amount of clothes, yet the average amount of time households spent washing clothes increased after 1925. This increase is partially accounted for by the fact that many urban households had previously sent their clothes to professional laundries. But the average amount of time spent washing clothes also increased for rural households with no access to professional laundries. That's interesting. So what I think is interesting here, and what I usually ask myself, what they're asking us, is why did it increase? Why did the average amount of time spent washing clothes increase also for rural households? So let's look down. I think that now is a good time to scroll down and look at the question stem to see how we should also look forward and not the questions, the question itself. And
Yeah, so this is phenomenal, and this is very instructive, because what Daniella showed us is reading through the passage and sort of, well, what might be the next step? Like, let's dive right into the question stem, right? Let's dive right into the answers. And so this is a phenomenal example of one particular approach to the question. But if we are to, say, apply some of these frameworks, right, that we just discussed, let's think. Before we dive right into the question stem, do we have a set of facts? Do we have an argument? Well, we read through it. We learned about electric washing machines, first introduced in the United States, significantly reduced the amount of time, but the average amount of time spent washing increased. This increase is partially accounted for by the fact that many urban households had previously sent their clothes to professional laundries, but the average amount of time also increased for rural households. We seem to have a set of facts, a collection of statements that isn't advanced or isn't used to make a particular claim, a particular so what, a particular conclusion on the basis of the statements. Now, with that in mind, as Daniella heightened our awareness to, we have some paradox. We have some interesting fact pattern here in the final sentence. And note, as we go, we're also highlighting and identifying some of these key signifiers, these key terms. So, but the average amount of time spent washing clothes also increased for rural households with no access to professional laundries. So what kind of unstated premises or what kind of assumptions is the author, is the passage, hoping that we read into it? Well, if we look at the case of electric washing machines, we can think of a bar graph in our mind of electric washing machines generally, which is, let's say for an individual or for a household, the amount of time they would use and spend on an electric washing machine would be a decrease in the amount of time without it. That's what they're first trying to suggest, because it significantly reduces the amount of time. However, the average amount of time households actually spent washing their clothes increased after 1925, increased after the introduction. So before we're even getting to the questions then, before we even getting to the answers, we ask ourselves, how is this paradox possible? This machine introduced in 1925, right? We can even draw a timeline. Whatever visual or whatever mental model is most apt for our conceptualization of the facts, we introduce the washing machine, which on its own can reduce the amount of time spent, yet the average amount of time spent actually increased. How is this possible? Well, they actually resolve the paradox for us because they tell us that many urban households, a qualifier on which households, had previously sent their clothes to professional laundries. So it turned out that it wasn't that they were, say, just hand washing their clothes at home, and that might be what would take more time. Actually, they were having other folks do it. So they themselves were not the ones spending the time. And now, as Daniella called our attention to, we have this additional paradox, except this time it's unresolved. The average amount of time spent washing clothes also increased for rural households. So note the close reading here. We have to identify all the qualifiers and all of the quantifiers and the key transition or contrast terms, because within our collection of households, we have households that are urban, households that are rural, and maybe we even have other types of households. But for our purposes, we'll consider only the urban and rural. But in this case, we can't explain away the paradox with these professional laundries, right? Maybe they were washing it by hand. Maybe they were just hang drying it in their own locations. So what might? What else could possibly explain this? So we want to try to first break down and identify, in this case, the different paradoxes and effects, and hypothesize and think about what those explanations could be. So with that interlude, we'll hand it back to Daniella.
Thanks. So what can these hypotheses be? And what are these hypotheses about rural households versus urban households? So one potential hypothesis could be that rural households maybe are different in some way in terms of their use of clothing. And maybe with that hypothesis, I think it's fair to move on and look at the question stem and perhaps look at the answer choices.
Excellent.
So now we can look at the question stem, which says, which of the following, if true, most helps to explain why the time spent washing clothes increased in rural areas? So we predicted what we were going to talk about. We're trying to resolve this paradox of why has the time spent washing clothes increased in these rural areas, increased in general in these rural areas, despite the increase of washing machines. So we're looking for an alternative explanation related to rural areas, which means that we're not looking for an explanation related to urban areas, which could be a potential red flag for answer choices. And also, we're not looking for an answer choice that's related to the urban areas. So what we are looking for, a description of rural areas. We're not looking for an answer choice that addresses professional laundries, nor urban areas. So let's look at answer choice A. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to look for an answer choice that addresses that paradox about rural areas and eliminate answer choices that don't address that paradox. And with that in mind, we'll look at the first answer choice. And remember, it's important to look at all of the answer choices as we're just trying to get at the best answer. One last note about the question stem is that it's saying, which of the following, if true? So we're adding a statement to our set of facts to explain the time spent washing clothes. So we're trying to explain why the time spent washing clothes increased in rural areas. So finally, answer choice A. People with access to an electric washing machine typically wore their clothes many fewer times before washing them than did people without access to electric washing machines. And I think that this seems like, to me, a decent answer. It, to me, said people with access to an electric washing machine typically wore their clothes many fewer times before washing them than did people without access to electric washing machines. So perhaps people in rural areas actually washed their clothes and spent more time washing their clothes because they're in rural areas, which could be true. So we're going to keep answer choice A as a contender.
Yeah, and so one note here in breaking down this paradox, as Daniella showed us in this case, is, again, think about the unstated premises, the unstated assumptions. Time spent washing must necessarily mean, for a particular machine, that you just spend less time washing your clothes generally. But what if you're using the machine more often, right? So it's not just a particular cycle of a machine, but if we actually break down, it might be the time of a cycle times the number or the frequency of its uses. And so that's one breakdown of the components of time spent washing. So again, the unstated premise, the unstated assumption is that in this particular case, there would be no change. There would be no difference in the number of times one wore one's clothes if you had access to a washing machine, electric washing machine or not.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Now I think it's important that since we resolved answer choice A, to show why the rest of the answer choices are wrong. We'll go through this quite quickly as you have other questions to go through, but if you have any questions, please pop in the chat. So answer choice B says, households that had sent their clothes to professional laundries before 1925 were more likely than other households to purchase an electric washing machine when they became available. So here there's a couple of red flags. The first here is that it's talking about professional laundries before 1925, which is irrelevant to our current, which is one of the red flags that we talked about before. So that is one of the issues, and I think the key issue here. For answer choice C, people living in urban households that had previously sent their clothes to professional laundries typically owned more clothes than did people living in rural households. Again, here we see our two big red flags. The issues, it's talking about people in urban households and their relationship with professional laundries. And here we're really talking about, we're trying to get at rural areas. The answer choice D, the earliest electric washing machines required the user to spend much more time beside the machine than do modern electric washing machines. Are we talking about the modern versus the old electric washing machines? No, we're just talking about the washing machines established after 1925 and their impact on rural areas. Again, irrelevant and out of scope. So I'll just X these three out for now. And then lastly, in the 1920s and 30s, the proportion of rural households with electricity was smaller than the proportion of urban households with electricity. This is talking about the relationship between the proportion between rural and urban households. Is that relevant to the amount of time that they're spending doing laundry? No. So it's really talking about something that's not necessarily relevant to what we're trying to get at here, which is to explain the amount of time. Jonathan, do you have anything else to add? And that confirms our answer choice A.
Yeah, this is phenomenal. And again, this process illustrates how front-loading much of the predictive effort of what the gaps in the logic, what the unstated premises, what the assumptions are, can help us avoid these trap answers. Like as Daniella showed us, whoa, hold on. Before 1925? Nope. Wait, hold on. Urban? Nope. Wait, we're talking about comparing to urban again? Nope. Wait, we're comparing to modern? Wait, nope. So as we practice, as we drill, as we go through many, many more iterations of applying these skills, we're going to see how the difference in approach can unlock tremendous impact, as Daniella has showed us.
Awesome. So now we're going to move on to the next question, which is, I'll just read it aloud. This is a different kind of question. As we can see, there are two blanks here. This is one of the classic vocabulary fill in the blank questions. And with these questions, I really like to get into the mind of the test taker. With these questions, as we talked about on our first verbal reasoning webinar, we're always looking for the clue. We're looking for the clue that the test maker is trying to get us to realize, which will guide us to the correct answer choice. And we're going to look for that right now. So we're going on a clue hunting mission in the mind of the test maker. So it says, scientists are not the only persons who examine the world about them by the use of rational processes, although they sometimes blank this impression by extending the definition of scientist to include anyone who is blank in his or her investigational practices. So let's look at that again and look for the clue this time. Scientists are not the only persons who examine the world about them by the use of rational processes. So, and then it says, although they sometimes blank this impression. So let's pause there. Scientists are not the only persons who examine the world about them by the use of rational processes. Although what do they try to do? They're not the only people who examine the world through rational processes, although they sometimes blank this impression by extending the definition. So if they're extending the definition, we have two clues here, although and extending. And what are they trying to extend what are they trying to extend the definition of? The scientists to include anyone, which is our third clue, who is blank in his or her investigative practices. So if we're including, that means that we're trying to broaden the scope of what it means to be a scientist. So what could go along those lines of including anyone in that way? So, but actually, we're not quite sure. We can't find, our goal here is to find a synonym of what this word could potentially be. And we're not even going to look at the answer choices. So let's actually go for the second blank first and think about what is a word that can mean that. So scientists are not the only persons who examine the world about using rational processes, but they're trying to include anyone who is blank in his or her investigational practices. So we're trying to look for a word actually that could mean rational. And is there a word that means rational here? Intuitive, haphazard, means all over the place, and logical. Logical could be a synonym for rational. So that would go there. And then here, although they sometimes blank this impression by extending blank this impression, are they trying to hide this impression? No, because they're trying to include here. We're not trying to conceal or hide. Or are they trying to undermine this impression? Are they trying to dig at the base of it and get rid of it? No, because they're trying to include. So create would be the correct answer here. Jonathan, do you have anything else to add?
This is great. So again, it's about key signifiers and breaking down the logic, syntax, and structure of a particular sentence or set of sentences. And as Daniella showed us, we don't necessarily even have to know the definition of a particular word. So it's not merely a vocabulary test. It's a reasoning test. It's inferring and analyzing the meaning in a particular context. And there's a number of different approaches, a number of different ways of using the key signals and logical signifiers within the sentence. But again, using that power of prediction, right? So if I were to look at number one, I'd say, although they sometimes give this impression, that might be the first term that comes to mind. And as Daniella showed, the prediction might be for box two, oh yeah, that rational processes. So that way, we come to the answer choices, we beeline to the ones that match our predictions.
Now we're going to try one more. Again, let's try to look for the clues, this time on the first round, and then we will look and try to look for synonyms and think of synonyms of the words we want to put in the blanks. So let's start out with, new technologies often begin by blank. That doesn't help us. New technologies, no clues there. Blank, begin by blank what has gone before. So so here they begin by, some things that come to mind could be begin by copying, or rejecting. So new technologies copying or rejecting what has come before, and they change the world later. Think how long it took for power using companies to recognize that with electricity, they did not need to cluster their machinery around the power source in their days of steam. Instead, power could be blank in their processes. So we're saying here, let's look at the structure of it a little bit. They're saying, let's think about something in the past, and instead, power could be blank in their processes. So they thought that they did not need to cluster it, machinery around the power source, as in the days of steam. Instead, power can be something else, not clustered. In that sense, many of today's computer networks are still in the steam age. Their full potential remains unrealized. So let's look at the second blank first, or the first blank first, because we have some synonyms here. So let's look for words that can be copying or rejecting. So uprooting, it could be similar but not exactly copying or rejecting. Dismissing could mean rejecting, and mimicking. So let's look at B and C one more time, and within the context of the sentence. New technologies often begin by blank what has gone before, and they change the world later. So I think that the answer would be here, if we're looking at they change the world later, they wouldn't be rejecting. Perhaps they'd be mimicking. And then now let's look at the second blank. Instead, power could be blank in their processes. In that sense, many of today's computer networks are still in the steam age. So instead of clustering, we don't want consolidated around, because it's the opposite of that. And it's not incorporated into. So instead, it would be transmitted to. And in both cases, the clue would be to cluster and to change. So, Jonathan, do you have anything else to add here? I'll just clear out my notes for a little bit and check off.
Yeah, so as we look at, if we take a look at blank one, again, looking at the key contrast here, they begin by X, what has gone before, and they change the world later. So if they're not changing what has gone before because they change the world later, then they're copying or preserving or mimicking what has gone before. So indeed, that prediction proves correct. And with the second blank, with the second prediction, think how long it took power-using companies to recognize that with electricity, they did not need to cluster around the power source, as in the days of steam. Instead, what are the predictions or words that come to mind when we think of the transfer, the use of electricity, the transmission of electricity? So indeed, our prediction on how electricity is transferred, because of the change in technology, realizing they did not need to cluster their machinery around the power source, enables us to reach the prediction for blank number 2. All right, here we go. Objectively, of course, the various ecosystems that sustain life on the planet proceed independently of human agency, just as they operated before the hectic ascendancy of Homo sapiens. Whoa, that's a mouthful. What did we just read? Okay, the ecosystems that sustain life on the planet proceed independently of human agency. Okay, so they're not just dependent entirely on human agency, just as they operated before the hectic ascendancy of Homo sapiens or of humans. We don't have to be evolutionary biologists. We don't have to have any subject matter expertise in any domain on the GRE. It is, again, a reasoning test. Okay, let's take it as given. But it is also true that it is difficult to think of a single such system that has not, for better or worse, been substantially modified by human culture. Okay, so statement one is basically telling us the ecosystems that sustain life, like the natural world, the ecosystems that sustain life, were not dependent on humans. They existed, they operated before humans came to be. But, however, by contrast, it is also true that it is hard to think of a single such system that has not, for better or worse, been changed a lot or substantially modified by human culture. Not dependent, but changed a lot by humans. Nor is this simply the work of the industrial centuries. It has been happening since the days of ancient Mesopotamia. It is coeval with, and when we see a term or a phrase or sometimes a sentence that is underlined or bolded, we know a question will likely follow from a passage or set of passages that will ask what is the role or definition or meaning of that in the context of that sentence or passage. It is coeval with the origins of writing and has occurred throughout our social existence. Hold on, what are all these it's referring to? It. Nor is this. It seems to be referring back to the nature of how humans substantially modify these systems being the ecosystems that sustain our life. Okay, great. We're asking, we're reflecting, we're going as we go. Coeval with the origins of writing has occurred throughout our social existence. And it is this irreversibly modified world from the polar caps to the equatorial forests that is all the nature we have. Statement of facts or argument? Seems like a statement of facts. But buried within, we have a number of seemingly complex claims or statements about the roles of humans in changing a lot these various ecosystems that sustain life, indeed, all the nature we have. All right, once we've broken that down and interpreted for ourselves what the set of facts, what the particular statements are, what they signify in relation to one another, we can dive right in. Seems we'll have to erase that first. So, consider each of the three choices separately and select all that apply. So we spoke about this earlier. We can have a traditional 5 multiple choice options. We can have a vocabulary type 1, fill in the blank, a vocabulary type 2, sentence equivalence. We've now seen a number of each of these questions. Now we can select all that apply. So it could be answer choice A, it could be B, it could be C, it could be A and B, it could be B and C, it could be A and C, or it could be A, B, and C. So we have a lower probability if we just do the combinations here than we would have in a standard 5 multiple choice question. That said, same approach. Let's beeline to the correct answer choice. It can be inferred from the passage that the author would agree with which of the following statements. I'm literally visually blocking the answers from my line of vision. I don't even consider them before I have interpreted what the heck the question stem is even asking. It can be inferred from the passage the author would agree with which of the following. Again, once we drill through all the panoply of question types, we'll readily identify this as a type of must be true question, a direct inference from a set of facts. What must be true? And in these types of questions, with these types of question stems, it's going to require us to do particularly close reading and not read in any of those unstated assumptions, those unstated premises. Stay very close verbatim to the text, no more, no less. Again, we have this mental map, this mental model, because we spent that significant time up front breaking down, translating what the argument was. The argument was kind of like okay, various ecosystems that sustain life were not dependent on humans, but humans substantially modified or changed a lot these environments. And there were lots and lots of premises about how that's been going on for a very, very long time, and that this is all that nature is. So I can literally convey to you, once I've broken down the argument, what the basic architecture, the structure of the statements are. Choice A. Over time, the impact of human culture on the natural world has been largely benign. Now, yes, to some degree, there is a measure of vocabulary employed here. Benign. Let's say you didn't memorize, you didn't know that term, you hadn't heard it in other contexts. You might think of it or might infer from like a tumor or cancer being benign or like not bad. And whether it's on your flashcards and as you go and as you drill questions, you can add them to your vocabulary flashcards, whether it's looking at the Latin roots and if that's helpful, or just learning by association or visualization, or just in common parlance in our vocabulary, benign is just like, not bad, as opposed to, say, a malignant tumor. Well, the impact of human culture on the natural world has been largely, all right, we have to be careful with our quantifiers, largely benign, largely like not bad. Let's go back for a moment. And this is again where the close reading of a short passage is so critical. We know exactly where to go back to, where we described this substantially modified, the impact that human culture had. Remember? But it is also true, it is difficult to think of such a system that has not, for better or for worse, been substantially modified. So as we're going, we're asking ourselves, what is the author or the passage's tone? Is it particularly combative? Is it inquisitive? Is it fairly neutral? In this case, it's descriptive. It's fairly neutral. And even specifically, we have in this clause, for better or for worse. So certainly one of the trap answers will be trap answer choice A, which wants us to read in an unwarranted invalid inference and draw an invalid conclusion that the impact was largely benign. Choice B. It is a mistake to think that the natural world contains many areas of pristine wilderness. All right, we have many, we have a quantifier. It is a mistake, it is wrong, it is false, it cannot be true that. Various gradations of our logical equivalence. To think that the natural world contains many areas of pristine wilderness. Now again, yes, vocabulary does come into play. So yes, doing the flashcards, yes, drilling, yes, reading continuously, and developing and honing our vocabulary as we go is helpful. But if we think of pristine in some other context, pristine can mean like kind of like clean, like, oh, my room is like pristinely kept. So we might have heard that in that context or used it elsewhere. But it can also literally mean unaltered by humans. And so in that direct application, if you have that direct definition, then fantastic, we can see answer choice B and beeline it to it directly, because the author would indeed think it's a mistake to think the natural world contains many areas of pristine wilderness, because if we go to a direct close reading of the text, it is this irreversibly modified world that is all the nature we have. If 100% of the nature we have is irreversibly, permanently modified, permanently changed, then, going back to choice B, it certainly would be a mistake, it would be wrong, it would be false, it could not be true that the natural world contains many areas of unaltered by human wilderness. Remember, going back to our logical equivalents, logical opposites, if all of wilderness, all of nature is permanently altered, it cannot be that many areas are unaltered, untouched. B is our answer. However, with these types of questions, and they will clearly always state and even bold and underline them for us, select all that apply. Every single part of the GRE is a reading test, even the questions themselves across every single section. All right, so let's consider choice C. Choice C, the only, and we'll break down to and drill all of these key signifiers of formal logic in a whole lesson on its own. The only substantial effects that human agency has had on the ecosystems have been inadvertent. what's the unstated premise? What's the unstated invalid assumption being made here? That, hey, all the substantial effects, and we're using that same word because we're thinking it might be a trapped answer here, have been inadvertent. Again, there is some vocabulary at play here, but we might know already inadvertent is like unintentional, kind of like not on purpose, right? Hold on. First, for the answer choice A, they wanted us to conflate or to confuse the idea that significant permanent change was made with the valence or the tenor or the positive or negative nature of that change. Hey, there was permanent change made to all of nature. Therefore, our unmanaged mind, our untrained mind might think, oh, so that change must be benign. But no, if there's permanent, unalterable change to nature, maybe that's disastrous. Maybe that's making life on Earth uninhabitable. So too in choice C, it is absolutely unacceptable, a concrete categorical logical flaw, to conflate or to confuse the fact that substantial permanent change was made with the intent, with the purpose, the reasoning of that action. So we'll boil actually many of these logical flaws down next week in our analytical writing session in looking at dozens of the most common logical flaws that we see across the entire GRE. We've seen a number of them at play in this particular question. So again, choice B is correct. All right, we're wrapping it up here. We are almost there. Selection to indicate the best answer from among the 5 answer choices. All right, so we have our traditional 5 answer multiple choice, and this is one of these types of questions that has a series of questions following a particular passage. But again, this doesn't change fundamentally our approach, just important to note. And as we predicted, we had a bold or underlined phrase or sentence or term of art. Coeval with appears underlined in boldface. They will almost basically always tell you where to go look for it, so you don't have to go fishing. In the context in which it appears, coeval with most nearly means, again, in our minds, we block the answers. They're invisible. They don't exist. They're not even on the paper or on the screen yet. If we didn't predict already up front, we go back to the passage. We don't just reread that sentence on its own. We want to reread at least 1 to 2 sentences before and after to understand the logic, the structure, and the context of what a word could mean, because that word meaning could change depending on what came before and what came after. So let's start with the nor. Nor is this simply the work of the industrial centuries. Again, they were saying like humans substantially modified, substantially changed. But it wasn't just the industrial centuries. It's been happening since the days of ancient Mesopotamia. So it's like not just like recent history, it's like ancient history. Okay. It being, again, that change that humans have made on the various ecosystems that sustain life. It is coeval with the origins of writing. Again, multiple approaches, multiple ways to get to Rome, whether we just know what coeval with already means, or we can do some Latin root breakdown or pattern recognition with our minds. Oh, like like jointly, together, right? Like cooperation, like co-op. Avum, it happens to refer to something like age and time, but even if you don't know that, even if it's not on your vocab list, you can still infer the meaning entirely just from the context of the passage, without even knowing the meaning of the word, without even knowing the meaning of any of its roots. It is coeval with the origins of writing and has occurred throughout our social existence. Okay, so I think it's pretty fair to say like we would have some intuition even if we didn't know the meaning about co. Regardless of that, this we know has to relate to a temporal attribute or a time-related attribute, right? So the logical flow, the logical structure of this set of facts, of this set of statements was, hey, significant change was made by humans, but it wasn't just recent history, it was also ancient history. And also this coeval thing with the origins of writing, which was like, and again, you don't have to be a historian, you don't have to be an archaeologist, but that's like a long time ago, and has occurred throughout our social existence to produce the irreversibly modified world. That's all the nature we have. So something to do with togetherness, something to do with time. We go to the answers, we attack, we know exactly the criterion we're looking for. Influenced by, absolutely unrelated. Older than, okay, related to time. coincident with, related to time. Ooh, I see coincident. That's nice. I remember that co from the coeval, which actually appears here as well. Unimpeded by, unrelated to time, similar to no. Okay, so we have older than or coincident with. Coincident indeed is the proper answer choice here. Just in the interest of time, we will now go to our final question. Feel free, as always, to pop in questions, chat reflections into the chat. But with that, we'll dive into this final passage. As an example of the devastation wrought on music publishers by the photocopier, as an example of the devastation, brought on music publishers by the photocopier, one executive noted that for a recent choral festival with 1,200 singers, the festival's organizing committee purchased only 12 copies of the music published by her company that was performed as part of the festival. Set of facts or argument. The passage as itself is a set of facts. It's not making a claim, oh, but that executive is wrong, or oh, and that executive is right, or this is what we should do about it. But we have an argument baked in to the set of facts. That is an argument made by the executive referred to in the facts about her claims. So let's understand her argument for a second here of the executive, described in the passage, which itself is a set of facts. Okay. The executive is claiming devastation. Wow, what a drastic claim by music publisher, by the photocopier. So the photocopier destroyed music publishers. What's the premise? What's the piece of evidence given? Hey, in this single, one recent choral festival, there were 1,200 singers. And again, every part of the GRE is a reading test, a close reading test at that. The festival's organizing committee, okay, so already we're seeing unstated premises and assumptions baked into here, which is that if you have a choral festival, all the copies of music that will be purchased by the organizing committee, right? If this is like copies of music purchased. Now there's so many logical flaws buried in this argument. This is just one of them that we'll highlight for the moment. But again, illustrating the important role of qualifiers and of a close reading of which entities are being referred to. So the organizing committee only bought 12 copies of the music by her company that was performed as part of the festival. But there were 1,200 singers, right? So like 100x that. Then it must be that the photocopier has destroyed the music publisher industry. Now, so many flaws here, going from inference from just her company, going from an inference from these 12 copies. Again, could there have been other copies made? Is it possible that maybe they all have iPads, they all have digital screens? Maybe it wasn't the photocopier's fault, maybe it was some other technology. So many flaws in the argument to point out and break down. You can hypothesize or pick out a couple, but note we're doing all this work, we're spending all this time up front breaking down and understanding what could be some of the implicit premises, the assumptions, and the gaps in the argument. Okay. Now we let ourselves even read the questions then. All right, we have our 5 answer choices, fantastic. Which one of the following, if true, most seriously weakens the support the example lends to the executive's contention that music publishers have been devastated by the photocopier? All right. So again, the passage itself is a set of facts, but it's a set of facts about an argument. And we're specifically looking for an answer choice that will weaken that argument referred to in the passage. Specifically, how the example, right, of the, hey, the organizing committee bought 12 copies, but there were 1,200 singers, is disconnected from the conclusion that music publishers have been devastated by the photocopier. We've already identified a number of gaps, a number of flaws, and there are many more in that particular logic. All right, answer choice A. Only a third of the 1,200 singers were involved in performing the music published by the executive's company. Okay, so, I mean, you don't have to do the math, but like if you were to, 400 singers were involved in performing the music published by the executive's company. But hold on, the entire gap, the biggest gap in the logic, the fundamental flaw, relates to the inference of the number of copies made by an organizing committee, somehow indicating that music publishers have been devastated by the photocopier. So if it doesn't involve copies, we need to look for copies. This is telling us something about the number of singers that were involved. You would have to read in a lot of unvalid, unstated inferences to make that even possibly relevant. Half of the singers of the festival had already heard the music they were to perform before they began to practice the festival. All right, again, you don't have to do the math, but let's say you were to. 600 singers had already heard the music. Okay, we have to be careful because all of our cognitive biases that the test is really preying on are running in the backs of our mind. Okay, if I've already heard of something, what does that mean? What does that mean about whether I photocopied that music? What they want you to assume is that if you've already heard something, then you must have, say, memorized it, and therefore, say, perhaps copied it. And so, but would this fundamentally affect the contention that the photocopier devastated the publishing industry? Well, no, because having heard something, I could have heard something, but I've heard it once. That has absolutely no bearing, no impact on the relationship between copying, photocopying, and the songs being performed. But again, if you try to make all these logical leaps and do mental gymnastics to see how the answer could possibly relate to the flaw, then you're doing the test maker's work for them. Does not relate to copies. Does not relate to copies. Go away, trap answers. C, because of shortages in funding, the organizing committee of the choral festival, all right, I'm glad because I'm already seeing something relating to organizing committee because qualifiers of which entities are often tested of the choral festival required singers to purchase their own copies of the music performed at the festival. This is like music to my ears because we're talking about copies of the music. We're saying, hey, remember that Venn diagram of like who buys copies? And they wanted us to assume that like whatever the organizing committee buys must be all the copies that are bought. And therefore there's been this destruction wrought. Well, hold on. In this case, they're saying, actually, it is very well possible that there were 1,200 copies ordered, or even 2,400. Maybe everyone ordered 2. We don't know anything about the number of copies actually ordered, but it does tell us that they require them to purchase their own. So this is most definitely a beautiful, amazing answer choice C, because it does indeed weaken the fundamental logical flaw of the claim about photocopies. For completeness sake, let's take a glance at choice D. Each copy of music that was performed at the festival was shared by 2 singers. Okay, great. So what? This doesn't tell us anything about the relation between the photocopiers devastating music publishers. That's great that they all shared 2 singers, but like how many copies were there? Even if we're assuming that the number of copies present by that single publisher has anything to do with what's affecting the publishing industry writ large, it does not fill that logical hole in the argument and provide an alternative to weaken it. Choice E, as a result of publicity generated by its performance at the festival, the type of music performed at the festival became more widely known. Now we might just like dismiss it again as like, well, this is out of scope. Like we came into this, we beelined to the answer because we had a prediction, but let's try to have some empathy, right? And think about why this again would be a trap answer choice. One of the many reasons is because they want you to assume, they want you to infer improperly that, so it got publicity, right? So it became more widely known. Oh, okay, even though it's not written there whatsoever, it got more widely known, so I guess more copies were bought by the people who ended up hearing about it. What? Where did that come from? That's absolutely not present whatsoever in the words in answer choice E. No mention of copies, no mention of the connection between the number of copies bought and the singers. And Again, you would have to read in and do all this mental gymnastics to even possibly relate answer choice E at all to the fundamental logical flaw in the argument about the music publishing industry and photocopies. All right. With this, we are so thrilled to share with you. You can take a free practice test online. You can download the GREMax app on tablet and mobile. So yes, thank you so much for the questioner for clarifying that. At the moment, you can download the GREMax app on tablet and mobile. You can sign up for a free 20-minute consult with a GREMax team member. We're more than happy to stay online today as well, to do that even this evening. And these are some awesome reviews. And of course, we're here for questions and answers. We're so thrilled to have had you today. Thank you so much for your engagement. And please do feel free to stick around, ask any questions. We're here to help and serve you. Sounds great. Well, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.